You're listening to Narcotica, a podcast giving you the straight dope about drugs and the people who use them.
Hey Narcotica listeners, this is Zachary Siegel, and I'm broadcasting from Chicago, Illinois. The episode ahead is the final installation of our Beyond Borders series. Before we get started, I just want to briefly recap the first two segments, showing you how much ground we've covered. In the first episode, Narcotica's Troy Farah interviewed Sanho Tree, a fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies, about the U.S.'s dark legacy of exporting disastrous drug policy around the globe, and in particular, how that policy fuels waves of people fleeing violence and corruption in their home countries across the Americas and the Middle East. If you haven't listened to that, I highly recommend you do. The second segment in Beyond Borders, Philadelphia's roving journalist Chris Moraff interviewed Vice News' Keegan Hamilton about the myth and the man Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, who, in February, was found guilty on numerous counts ranging from operating a criminal enterprise, a vast operation distributing cocaine, heroin, and illicit fentanyl, and how corruption at the highest levels of government was complicit in it all. That episode, as well, is a must listen. Today, I'm excited to introduce you to author and journalist Dawn Paley, whose incredible book, Drug War Capitalism, exposes the powerful political and economic interests, such as U.S. oil companies, that benefit from a violent and paramilitarized war on drugs. I'm air quoting war on drugs because, as you'll learn from our interview in just a moment, this so-called war is not about controlling substances. It's about controlling people and their land and extracting every drop of value from it. Dawn Paley is an independent journalist who has been reporting from South America, Central America, and Mexico for over 10 years, and she's written numerous hard-hitting pieces for The Nation magazine. Before we get started, I just want to thank our loyal Patreon subscribers. We can't do this show without your support. Please subscribe and rate us on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts if you haven't already. It helps more people find our show. Without further ado, here is Dawn Paley. Thanks so much for coming on the show. I'm really excited to have you on and share your perspective with our listeners. I think few journalists, especially in mainstream outlets, have connected all the dots of the war on drugs in the way that you have. So thanks for being here.
Oh, thanks so much.
So to start off, in Drug War Capitalism, your book, you place violence across Colombia and Mexico in material, political, and economic contexts. And in doing so, you sort of unpack the true motivations for the war on drugs. Can you just start off by giving us an example of how, drug control and U.S. foreign aid are sort of used as a cover to advance interests of corporations?
That's a really good question, and it's deceivingly simple. So drug war capitalism, I wouldn't say it's necessarily about the true causes of the violence and the sort of, because I think the thing with the drug war, there's so much happening at the same time. So there are groups of people moving drugs, there are homicides that are linked to that movement, what I call the militarization of prohibition. But then there's also this undercurrent, which I argue in drug war capitalism is ignored, I think, in the media, and which is something that we need to highlight a lot more, which is how these kinds of violence actually also can benefit the interests of capital, the interests of corporations. So to come with one really concrete example, that's fairly well documented in Mexico. We could talk about the Juarez Valley. So listeners might remember when Ciudad Juarez was in the news quite a lot, which is a border city, right, which shares a border with El Paso, Texas, because it became the murder capital of the world, because of many killings of women, because of enforced disappearances, and so on. So not far outside of the city, in a rural area, there's another border crossing that's called Guadalupe Tornillo. On the Texas side, it's Tornillo, Texas, and then Guadalupe, Chihuahua on the other side. And residents have told journalists and international observers that, for years they experienced this extreme violence, largely at the hands of state forces, but it was reported in the media at the time as being a showdown between two drug cartels, and basically transformed that area of Guadalupe into a kind of a ghost town. So thousands of people left a town of thousands of people. Do you know what I mean? There was very, very few people left because of the violence directed towards the residents of the city. And it was always told within the sort of official discourse of, the war between these two cartels and so on. And so when the journalists started going in later and getting a better version of the story, they started to hear this over and over again. Well, actually, it was largely state forces, militarization, federal police, the military, and so on. And what was also happening at the time was the construction of the new border bridge and essentially the transformation of the small town of Guadalupe, largely agricultural town, into they're building these sort of this new concept in maquila manufacturing. So they're building these huge, not just maquila parks, where there's just clusters, as they call them, of assembly line factories, but actually where the workers would live inside the factories. So transforming the sort of whole geography as well of this little town. And so I think part of what drug war capitalism is sort of a call to look at other factors at play instead of just buying into this discourse that is so convenient for governments, for the US government, for the Mexican government, to be talking about, it's bad guys killing each other, and actually see, okay, who is actually being killed? This is like the weakest plank of their argument, is when you say, yes, but who are these people being killed? When 9 out of 10 times in Mexico, you don't even have an investigation, right? So like they're, constantly criminalizing the victims when there's not even an investigation. And oftentimes we don't even know who there are. The number of unidentified bodies right now in morgues in Mexico, for example, sort of flies in the face of the idea that we know who the victims are. In a proper way.
In this ghost town, when thousands of people left, in its place, a sort of like corporate feudal enterprise just magically appeared with a factory and people to live, and it essentially displaced one group and then moved in there to that's wild.
And there's a very famous family in that region called the Reyes Salazar family, and they were among the first to denounce the militarization, to speak out against it. But for years before that, they had also been organizing against all the toxic waste that was being dumped into the river systems, and just like a really activist family. And that family was obliterated. They were disappeared. Some of them were forced into the United States. Others were murdered. So it was like, first it was a campaign against the Reyes Salazar family, and then they just went off and sort of were able to disguise this mass displacement as a war on drugs. And like I said, like constantly criminalizing the victims, constantly saying it's a war between cartels. And by doing that, they tell journalists and they tell reporters and they tell people who would want to be in solidarity, it's too dangerous, you can't go there, don't step foot. Do you know what I mean? So it's just sort of like putting out these warning signs and saying it's no man's land, it's a war between cartels, and then transforming the economic, political, and social geography of the area. And that's one case that's well documented. Mm-hmm. I think the other thing with drug war capitalism is it's kind of like a call to, like, let's think about this differently. Let's, as journalists, do different kinds of research and different kinds of work on this. Because it's not a conclusive document saying this is what's happening. It's kind of like, let's shift our analysis so that we can try to get a better understanding of what's going on. Because there's so many cases that we don't know about, that we haven't heard about, that we haven't had the good reporting on yet.
Yeah, and that gets into why you're often critical of the dominant media narratives that only focus on like Narcos and these juicy stories of cartel territory and violence and these sort of intra fights among cartels. And of course, this is entertaining media, but it narrowly focuses on so much and the bigger picture gets lost. And so
Right.
and
And
so
there's a few, there's a few kind of crucial lines that I think would just keep in mind, like the greatest purveyors of violence in modern times are states. Like, so why are we going to focus on these demons, on these drug cartels, or even terrorist groups like ISIS, I would argue, when we see over and over and over again in the facts who are those that have the most weapons, the largest armies, the most at their disposal, plus the states over and over again, right?
Yeah, and this was so apparent to me following the trial of El Chapo Guzman recently, where all these like lurid details of payoffs and bribes and drug trafficking and just this vast network of criminal enterprise being unpacked in U.S. courts. And again, we just don't see so much of the other factors that are happening in Mexico that let someone like El Chapo Guzman thrive and run a business there, and who else is benefiting from his kind of business.
Right. And also that sort of trial is a very favorable way of airing again the official story, because anything that is not directly connected to this person becomes extemporaneous to the court case, so it's not heard, right? So we don't actually hear about the broader networks that are supporting this. It's all has to link back into this one man, and that's all we get to hear about.
The man,
and it's
the
like
myth.
But there's also a whole system, right? I mean, yeah.
And of course, after the trial and he's convicted and found guilty on all counts, it's sort of paraded as like, you know, the war on drugs is working. Like this is a huge success. And it's like, meantime, America's in the midst of a deadly overdose crisis where heroin and fentanyl have never been cheaper and more available. And yet the whole raison d'etre of the war on drugs is to make drugs scarce and expensive. Just like by every metric, this war is an utter failure. And then we get one court case that heralds it as a success.
Right. And that's where, like, you know, one of the arguments of drug war capitalism is that if we use their metrics, the drug war is a failure. Their stated metrics of lowering the street cost of drugs and dismantling these networks and so on. If we use their metrics, it's been a complete failure. But they continue to repeat this policy. And so the argument is partially like, maybe it's about something else then. Like maybe there's metrics that they're not stating, because if they came out and said like, this war is about displacing people from their land, you know, in the United States about incarcerating, you know, Black and brown, specifically young men and Indigenous young men. This is about, you know, social control. If they came out and stated that, I don't think they would be able to proceed, right?
Right.
But I think that if we do a sort of a reading against the grain, as Walter Benjamin would say, of the drug war, we can see that there's all these other impacts, which I think that, you know, it's been since Plan Colombia, which is where drug war capitalism starts in the year 2000, like almost 20 years of this kind of policy. And they just keep doing the same policy, right? Which is this massive investments in militarizing prohibition in the South, in South America and in Mexico. And we can't talk about unintended consequences. I mean, the UN still talks about violence being an unintended consequence of this kind of policy. And it's like, but after 20 years, it's not it's a known consequence. And in fact, I argue that it's a driving motivation for this kind of militarized prohibition is social control through homicide and massacre in the United States through the prison system.
Right. It might be unintended quotes, but it is foreseeable and foreseen over the last 2 decades.
And I think it would be debatable. How could you argue that's unintended? Maybe the first time you could say it was unintended. Yeah. But once it's a known consequence, I think it's a known consequence. It cannot be an unintended consequence anymore. But that kind of separation of sort of the actions, the policies from the effects, and the ability to sort of criminalize all of the victims is really one of the best things about this type of drug war, of discourse of war, I think, for the governments that are perpetrating it, is that it gives them this plausible deniability all the time. And it creates this sort of, well, you know, those who have lost a family member, those who have an incarcerated family member, they must have been doing something bad. Mm-hmm. Right, which is very polarizing socially.
Yeah, and like the the most potent and scariest illustration of that to me is really Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines, just extrajudicially killing anybody who is, quote, suspected of being engaged in using drugs or dealing drugs. Meanwhile, thousands of people are dead, and it's called a drug war. Like, that to me just is so infuriating, because like, this is a genocide. It's not
exactly.
It's terrible.
Yeah, that's I think one of the most sort of blatant examples, and I think Brazil is also sort of, I mean, with Bolsonaro moving towards a sort of Duterte kind of social cleansing model, totally racialized, of course, you know, especially along the lines of like extreme anti-Blackness. Mm-hmm. And using the drug war and using narcotics constantly as a sort of excuse why, right? And this is not new. This has been going on in Brazil for a long time. In fact, like one of the interesting things in Brazil is it was Lula that first brought in some of the mandatory sentencings and some of the harsh penalties for folks that are using substances. And so there's this, it's just this interesting thing, even from the 1960s, going back to the sort of, you know, the counterculture times. Julia Buxton, in her book, A Global History of Narcotics, which I think is a really fantastic book, she talks about how in the 60s, a regime from like the Soviets, from like Uzbekistan to like the United States, France, Cuba, like it did not matter sort of what the political position of the government was. They were using narcotics to take youth off the streets, basically. Mm-hmm. And so it didn't have a political ideology attached to it. It was sort of like just this very useful way of criminalizing, you know, big parts of the population. It goes back before that, but the 1968, I think, time is really interesting when looked at in that way. And I think today too, like we can see all these different governments, from the sort of progressive governments to these like super like, you know, like Duterte and Bolsonaro and then Trump, all still sort of hanging on to the militarized enforcement of prohibition as a key lever for domestic social control.
Yeah, and with Bolsonaro in Brazil, that's like, you know, he's got a U Chicago economist working in his, or advising him, and then I see an article in The Economist about Bolsonaro tackling the pension problem, and so it's just like totally fucking absurd when there is a serious fascist threat, someone who for the free market means we can just mow down the rainforest, like that's what the free market means for someone like Bolsonaro, and of course in these governments you still see how drugs are a scapegoat everyone can get behind.
Exactly. And it's interesting because during the Cold War, because I've just finished my Ph.D. dissertation, and I worked a lot on the ideas of how the war that we're experiencing now with the drug war is different from the Cold War. And one of the things about the Cold War was that the leaders of these regimes constantly had to be kind of outmaneuvering this political opposition. It was very clear that it was a political war, right? So it was like, you know, these young upstart guerrillas or organizers or unionists who are demanding a different society, and the government constantly saying, well, they're foreigners, they're communists, they're subversives, they're guerrillas, for this and that reason they should be killed. And today, the drug war, what it does, it puts us into this sort of alternate universe where it's totally depoliticized. So the idea is that all these people who are being murdered, who are being massacred, who are being disappeared, who are being displaced, they were bad. They're bad people. Yeah. And it also takes any kind of political content has been stripped out of it. And I think, you know, in some ways that's a consequence of the fact that it comes after the Cold War. So the political left was, you know, hit really, really hard, and I don't want to say destroyed because it's still there, but decimated. Mm-hmm. And the political content today, it's the right-wing political content. It's a reactionary political content. It's about taking more. It's about taking more land, taking more rights from people, you know, to undoing people's organizing. And so then we're supposed to believe that it's not political. It's not political because there's no leftists, because where's the leftists? And it's like, well, actually, I think, you know, 200,000 murders of mostly young men, mostly from poor communities over the last 12 years, that's political. I'm sorry, that is political. You have all of these mass graves. You have, you know, tens of thousands more people disappeared just in Mexico. That is not something that isn't political. So I think part of the other piece is like, working on how we think through that and repoliticize what's happening so that we can understand that we're actually living through these reactionary wars that are extremely right-wing and that require sort of like thinking and proposals about how we get out of this that aren't like, oh, well, we need like prison reform. Okay, yeah, that's fine, like the first step or whatever. But like, we need to think on a much more radical scale, because we're seeing how ideologically the same structures or the same systems of control, like with the drug war, can be used like from a sort of friendly left-wing kind of government to a extreme right-wing government with the same kind of ease, right?
Yeah, and when you put it that way, the sort of progressive policies and criminal justice reform that's like, bipartisan here, it only barely nibbles around the edges of the problems that are really, really endemic to this thing. And so like we get something like the First Step Act, which affects a tiny minority of the 2 million people who are incarcerated in this country. And it's like, it's funny that they call it the First Step Act, because it's just like the tiniest, most minute step someone can possibly take if they really want to tackle this problem.
And I think I've always kind of thought it was sad that left, that sort of establishment left that sees progress in these incremental things, and maybe, for some people there is some progress, maybe there's some improvements, wouldn't hold up the abolitionist left and say like, this is where we're going. Mm-hmm. But there's just like this total fear of being like too radical. But like when I sit down and listen to voices like anti-abolitionists like Miriam Kaba or Angela Davis, I'm always just like, yes, like these women are this is exactly where we need to go. This is the kind of way, the structural ways we need to think about this stuff, and not just sort of, well, let's make sure that people get 3 square meals a day when they're behind. It's like, okay, come on, like the abolitionist stuff is really exciting. And so is, I think, the conversation around, regulation, but all the way, not like, okay, let's legalize marijuana. Let's talk about, regulation or decriminalization of all substances, and take the discussion all the way to its logical endpoint, which is where we need to go.
Yeah, totally. And when it comes to the sort of small incremental progress, like the Marijuana Justice Act, all the presidents in 2020 are getting behind, which would just effectively deschedule cannabis, there's still a section of Democrats, the sort of corporatist wing, that is still against this stuff. And so the progress is slow and ongoing. And even with something like cannabis legalization, there is still so much pushback, and then rehashing old fears about psychosis and murder and violence related to this drug. So,
Thank you, Malcolm Gladwell. I don't know if you sound like...
Exactly. And so I have a piece coming out soon in the New Republic just about just the rhetorical, political history of using old fears around cannabis. And I thought that strain of panic was dead. Like, I did not think you could tap that vein again in 2019. But of course, you get someone like Gladwell and the Marshall Project buying into it. And then soon we're discussing, how many people are going to come down with schizophrenia when we legalize cannabis. It's like, you gotta be fucking kidding me.
Right. And I mean, I think I recently heard some testimony by Alejandra Ocasio-Cortez, and she was saying, the warning that I think a lot of activists have said, but it was really amazing to hear say it. Like, this is not something that white people should be making money on. Like the communities who have paid so heavily over the past decades, but with their lives, for the prohibition of marijuana, should be the ones who are given like the possibility of participating in it once it's like a legal business, and participating as owners and as leaders. And I think like part of the thing that's so frustrating about sort of what you're identifying is it also seems like there's this other cycle where these people who are so against it, the next day they're like entrepreneurs.
Right.
And they're the ones they're perfectly positioned have made this huge investment and are now just going to be like, and that's how they're coming over to the other side. It's like, well, actually you can make a lot of money on this. Great. Okay. Actually, you know what? Yeah. But it's like that's not, I think it's really, really good that there's strong voices out there. And I also think we need to think about marijuana as sort of it's so different from some of the other substances, but it's a test case, right? Like,
it's a different kind of capitalism, like more just American capitalism. I'm going to get into the business of this and of course exclude the communities who've been ravaged by this very business for a century.
Exactly.
So I would jump back to something you were talking about moments ago about how we blame the victims. So when someone gets killed, it's like, oh, well, they were involved in this shady business, and that's what happens when they are asking for trouble. And I feel like when back in the midterms, when the Republicans, with the help of media, stirred up this frenzy about the so-called migrant crisis, this word migrant is just doing so much heavy lifting for the audience. And can you sort of elaborate on like who migrants are when they show up at our border and yeah, like I just feel like we're not at all told what conditions they're fleeing, why they're fleeing. They're just called migrants.
Sure. I mean, that's another really big question, right? I think something important to sort of point out is that now you'll probably recall, like in 2014, there was an unaccompanied child minors crisis, right? So there was all these young folks showing up without their parents and crossing the border. And then the recent wave has been really tied to the caravans and also family separation. These are all Central Americans. And that is because the Mexicans that come, Mexico has an agreement with the United States, they're immediately deported without trial, right? So they're not held, or that normally they're not held unless they make an asylum claim. But so Mexicans and Mexican children in general are just being turned around and immediately just deported back to Mexico. The Central Americans have a slightly longer process, often months long, often longer, where they're held and then they're put on these like show trials, right? Where there's, 20 people at a time in front of a judge, not understanding what's going on. These folks are fleeing the impacts of like a century of US imperialism, right? And they're fleeing societies that are so violent. And there's just a lot of day-to-day quotidian violence. And then there's a lot of violence like by state forces, by the police, just like a lot of corruption. And this violence is, I argue, a direct impact of the inequalities and the sort of structural violence worker formations that have been created in Central America by the presence of United States soldiers and United States advisors. So you have these, incredibly bloody civil wars. But I don't like the word civil war. I don't like the word internal conflict. Like none of the terminology really works. But I mean, you had genocide in Guatemala, right? You had these huge massacres. And this is just going back to the somewhat recent history, the second half of the 20th century after the Second World War. Before that, you also had all kinds of massacres and awful stuff under US supervision. But so the peace accords in Central America were signed in the 1990s, and right away, like within a couple years, I always come back to this, and it's a fairly detailed example, but I think it's a good illustration. In Guatemala, the last peace accord was signed in 1996, and it prohibited the army from participating in domestic affairs, from patrolling, from being in the communities. The army was supposed to stay on the streets and just be an army just in case there was an invasion from a neighboring country. By 1999, the army is back on the streets doing joint patrols in the neighborhoods, in the communities, in the villages, on the pretext of controlling narcotics. So you have the immediate remilitarization of Guatemala. Similar things happen in El Salvador. The U.S. converts their bases into now they're anti-narcotics bases and forward operating locations instead of being sort of Cold War, anti-communist bases. Exactly. So you have basically this really, really short sort of a blink of something that might appear to be, okay, we're moving into peacetime. And then these nations are immediately remilitarized under the pretext of the war on drugs. But at the same time, the U.S. is pushing policy like forcing these countries to, not to go into debt, like all the sort of austerity measures that we talk about. So paying massive amounts of what the income that they have into their debt payments, not being allowed to operate any kind of deficits, starving the public sector, starving education, starving the healthcare system, right? Like, so all of these, pushing campesinos off their land, imposing, really contaminating mining projects and oil projects, and, monocultures, monocrops, like the palm oil is a big one in Central America. All of these factors pushing people into the urban areas where there's no services, right? There's huge inequality, and then propping up political regimes, like the coup in Honduras in 2009, and everything that's happened in Honduras. We can't separate the fact that many of these migrants now participating in the caravans, and the fact that the caravans are first organized in Honduras from the coup d'etat, because we've seen just a deepening of inequality since then, and et cetera. So it's really to look at it and say, well, there's like violence and corruption, but like there's a direct tie to the U.S. economic policy, U.S. military policy in the region, creating the amount of people. And it's like they're not migrating necessarily for a better life. They're migrating for survival. Like, because, I've interviewed migrants who are transiting through Mexico, and a lot of them are working, and they're saying, well, yeah, I had a job at a maquila, I was working, but I was having to pay so much extortion every week that my salary wasn't even like enough. You know what I mean? So it's just, it's not going away.
Right.
It's an exodus. It's a huge crisis. Like, I think, on the scale of what's happening, or, when so many people were leaving Syria, and it was always being in the news, right, of how Europe is becoming more and more of a fortress, especially like in the Balkans and so on, to keep out migrants. And it's like, it's a similar parallel. It's a sort of situation that is that bad. There is that much violence. And then you also have a huge amount of Mexicans who are leaving really difficult situations, violence, often first migrating internally within Mexico, and then still moving up to the United States. Although they say that net Mexican migration is basically leveled off at zero, because many have also decided to leave the United States or have been removed from the United States. But that's kind of an overview. I think the big mistake is to just see it as someone's flippant desire to, like, oh, I'm going to go try this out. It's like, no, people are now leaving because they're just, survival is not possible in their own country.
Right, and they show up at our doorstep based on decades of policies that we exported there, and we shut them out. And that's exactly right. When in Syria, everyone was trying to enter Germany through Greece, and they shut the borders down and just leaving people stranded. It's the same thing we're seeing playing out everywhere.
And it's also like, and I'm not certainly not as much of a connoisseur of events in Syria, but it's like the West has seriously been participating in the destabilization of that country, right? I mean, it's not just, you could blame Assad, not a fan, but also like, obviously all these different militias and all these different groups, or like, for example, the Saudis right now in Yemen and so on. It's like operating with, not just complicity from the United States, much support from the United States. And this is impacting the lives of regular folks. So it's a sort of boomerang, on these policies, that if you're going to go in and fuck countries up, like, people are going to leave. And then it's just like the biggest slap on the face, because not only are people being forced to leave their countries, when they come to the United States, they're treated as though they're beggars, or they're treated as though they're people who, just in the most just xenophobic sort of racist language. It's really hard to hear.
Yeah, and I think it's going to get worse in the immediate future. And I think it's really hard for people to understand and see the magnitude and scope of this. Like, it is millions of people moving across continents, and it's a big question mark how this is all going to look in a few years. But it's totally unsustainable and really scary. And again, it to bring it back to sort of drug war capitalism, what you're really describing also reminds me of Naomi Klein's disaster capitalism. Like, in these sort of extreme moments of duress and panic, policy is malleable and it can bend and move and be changed to fit, certain interests. And I think like Hurricane Katrina is probably a really potent example of that, when Arne Duncan, Obama's Secretary of Education, said the best thing that happened to education in New Orleans was Hurricane Katrina, which is a disgusting thing to say. And here we are in 2019, and New Orleans is the first all-charter school district.
Brutal.
It became totally privatized. And so we see what happens in these sort of moments of extreme conditions.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm definitely very inspired by Naomi Klein's work and disaster capitalism, and other work that she's done, like her Puerto Rico stuff recently has been really good. And so, part of the argument of drug war capitalism is that they manufacture a crisis, essentially, which is a crisis based on the militarization of prohibition. And while, for example, in Mexico, while there's just this huge spike in homicides, and all of a sudden there's like bodies being hung from bridges and people disappearing or being disappeared, and just all this carnage in regions that haven't experienced that kind of violence in 100 years. At the same time, they pass an energy reform, right? They pass an education reform. They start, doing politically all of these things, which are very pleasing to big capital. Enrique Peña Nieto, the former president of Mexico, he was on the cover of Time magazine with the headline "Saving Mexico" in February of 2014, right after he passed the energy reform, basically saying, finally, they opened the energy sector up in Mexico. And I think it took a society that was terrorized, a society that was fractured, a society that's incredibly polarized, around the discourse of, it's even within families, like someone disappears and their cousins and their aunts and uncles stop talking to that part of the family and say, well, they must have been involved in something, and for our own safety, we better not, hang out with them or get close to them. Polarizing society, fragmenting society to that degree, as a sort of necessary step towards making these extremely unpopular policy changes, which are transforming the entire economy of Mexico is now in a process of transformation. And interestingly, during Plan Colombia in Colombia, the state oil company was also privatized. And they talk about, Plan Colombia now, because so many years later, the State Department itself and the Colombian bureaucrats and so on, they say, well, yes, we might have failed on, some of the more direct goals, like the cocaine stuff, just a little details or whatever, but we were highly successful in creating, a better business climate and so on. They themselves sort of admit that those are sort of driving or what the success was of these plants, right?
Right, and it gets back to, in Colombia right now, there's a surge in cocaine production. And over the past, decade, we've in the U.S. in our name has invested tons and tons of money to eradication policies in Colombia. And here we are in 2018 with headlines, coca production surging in Colombia. And it's like, again, on our own metrics, this is a failure. And then what you're saying again is, well, what are the other metrics? What things are actually going on that might be benefiting people?
And also, can we please look at the drug war not in a vacuum as something that's happening like separate from every other event in history? Like, no, it's happening within a matrix that includes existing capitalism, it includes the state, it includes social movements, it includes territory. Like, it's not, there's these maps with the arrows on them, and they're supposed to show us like different colored arrows or the different cartels, and it's just like, what is, and who invents this stuff? Like, once you're working on it, you're just, this doesn't make, of course it's going from like the bottom of the country to the top of the country, like, but beyond that, there is absolutely nothing that in those maps that reflects it. It's like a way of talking about violence that doesn't actually say anything. All it does is it, I think it paralyzes people, it paralyzes researchers, it makes people fearful, and it polarizes. So it's a really effective discourse in terms of like talking like a state, but I don't think that's what we as journalists or researchers or folks, that want a different and better world, it just doesn't make sense for us to talk in those same terms.
Right. And so much of the drug war and prohibitive policies really criminalize and do harm to the end user. Like at the very, very bottom of this network, you have a corner dealer selling tiny amounts, like, marginally impacting the local supply to addicted users. And this is where we see the really harsh and harmful policies that appear to be doing something about this problem really only affect the bottom, the lowest hanging fruit. And it's also reminds me of sort of the gun policy debate in America, where you only see end users who get criminalized for possessing guns, and yet we hear nothing about the manufacturers, suppliers, and distributors of weapons get any brunt of the harsh policies. We just see young Black men get years and years and years because Michael Bloomberg wants to see gun violence end, and all we do is see the end users get criminalized. It's the same way with drugs.
I think it's interesting to, like, so you brought up El Chapo, right? So we also see like this person who's now, we're told, responsible for like thousands of deaths and all this stuff. He gets a fair trial. What do the young folks, the young, mostly young people who are the low ends of these same networks through Mexico, what do they get? They get extrajudicial assassination. They get hung off of bridges. They get, because they're also among the victims of this war. Like, it's not to say don't criminalize the victims. It doesn't mean none of the people who have been victimized in this war were participating in illicit economies. No, obviously some of them are participating, right? Nobody deserves to die like that.
Right.
And I think innocence is a really, really bad plank to stand on in terms of like arguing for change. Jackie Wang has a really, really fantastic essay in her new book, Carceral Capitalism, called Against Innocence, where she just really hammers home like why arguing from innocence, it doesn't make sense. But we see the people at the lowest end, the sort of, so one of the places where I worked a lot in the north of Mexico, folks would say to me when the drug trade started changing, there was basically new bosses that came in, and they went up to the kids who were already hanging out on the corner, playing dominoes or drinking beer or whatever, just hanging out, and said, okay, you're working for us now. Like, here's a radio and we'll pay you every week. And what the work that they ended up doing sort of for the cartels was very, very similar to the sort of existing sort of structure of hanging out and being part of a clica, or just being like like a marginalized youth. But then those kids were the same ones who were picked up en masse and, massacred and murdered and put in jail and disappeared and so on. And so that's how the low end, the sort of, but it's not the low end, it's the majority of people interacting with that economy. That's how they're treated, right? They're treated as subhuman. And then you have this figure of El Chapo is sort of the worst of the worst and so on. And he actually gets a fair trial. And I'm sure he's getting his 3 square meals a day. And I'm not, in favor of the prison system, but it's like this appearance that he got heard, right? And it's like, actually, that's a very exceptional treatment for somebody suspected of participating in this economy in Mexico.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. And I think what we're sort of getting to here is like the experiences of everyday people that might lead them to illicit markets or to the drug trade or to cliques and gangs. No policy is affecting that experience. No policy is giving people opportunity or a way out of that. So that's why we criminalize the possession of a drug or a gun, and they get locked up, and the policy upstream that could prevent them from seeing that as an opportunity or an option
is anti-capitalist.
It's not on the table, right?
It's anti-capitalist.
You would have to tackle poverty, and no one wants to do that. So let's criminalize guns and drugs, or
tackle extreme wealth.
Right.
Like, every billionaire is a policy failure. That was another one I saw recently, and I was like, oh, that's a great way of looking at it. I mean, it really to like capitalism is the root problem here. And so to pretend that there's ways like, so the new president of Mexico is talking about, you know, opening up all these new AMLO. He's talking about opening up all these new spots in universities because every year in Mexico, there's hundreds of thousands of young folks who apply to do a bachelor's degree in a public university and who are turned away. And so he's saying, we're going to open up all these new spots and so on. It's like, okay, that's good. That's going to help for about 5 years. And then they finish their degrees and then there's still nothing at the end. And there's no such thing as a living wage in Mexico. You know, you can be working in the border right now and making less than $10 a day. And your cost of living is not that much cheaper than it is in the US. People cross into the US, into Texas to buy goods at lower prices than they can buy them in Mexico. So you tell me, like, at what moment are we talking about a meaningful solution to inequality and creating opportunities for people if we're not actually talking about, you know, reforming or completely transforming the capitalist system? And so please, so it's too radical, you know, you can't talk about that kind of stuff, but luckily I'm not a politician and I don't plan to be one, so.
Right. And it just got me thinking, like, AMLO's policy to open up universities for people, it's just going to create the problem in America, which is you have a bunch of overeducated millennials who can't find fucking work. I have a master's degree and I'm like, you know, freelancing and doing like 10 jobs. Like,
I wouldn't say you guys are the problem. I mean, I would say the problem is that you guys aren't making a revolution right now. But the problem is capitalism. The problem isn't you guys. I mean, the problem is the system. And I mean, another thing is, many of y'all, I don't know about yourself, but like have huge amount of debt. That's just unbelievable. Like on these conditions where it's, is that real? Like, I still feel like I'm like an old fashioned kind of like old lady because I went to a public university in Canada and, you know, our system is just not as horrible as it is in the United States. But yeah, you know, there's one of the people I work with has this really, I think, useful idea. And she talks about like a practical horizon and a horizon of desire. When we're thinking about movements, when we're participating in movements, a practical horizon is like, what can we actually change? You know, what are these incremental things that can improve people's lives and so on? And sort of work on those things because it does make sense. Like, we do want, like, you know, Obama was better than Trump. Hello.
Right.
Like,
objectively.
Yes, right? Like certain policies, certain ways of you know, Obamacare, like universal health care as it should be, is better than what you guys have. It's better. It's incrementally better. But let's not get like stuck on that as this sort of end thing. I think the other thing is the horizon of desire. Like, what do we want to move towards? Like beyond single payer, or what do they call it? Well, beyond, you know, I want to say Obamacare, but I don't think that's like the right term anymore.
Well,
right?
There's Medicare for all, which is like the one that, you know, there's varying forms of it on the table coming up in 2020.
So like, let's like, yes, like I think signing a petition and like helping out and working on those campaigns is good, but also like that's not an end goal, because you still have people who can't, you know, see, and people whose teeth are messed, and people who have so many other problems that aren't addressed, like, you know, like including, I think, a lot of folks who are using narcotics in the United States who aren't being included, or so it's like I think we always need to be pushing for more and say, well, that's really not pragmatic, but also talking about what those things are. And I think, you know, harm reduction and regulation and legalization and demilitarization of prohibition are like really utopian worlds, because it does and has felt like so impossible for there to be any change there. And if we can make some changes on this stuff, I think, you know, prison abolition, all this kind of stuff, it's actually, there's tons of inspiring stuff happening right now.
Especially in Canada, where drug user organizing is leading to really inspiring and phenomenal policies, where in Vancouver and the downtown east side, you have buying clubs for drug users so that they know that their heroin isn't going to fucking kill them. And so in America, that's slowly being exported here. Like there are drug user unions here in America. There are unsanctioned supervised injection sites here in America. And slowly people in public health and harm reduction are going rogue. They're defying the law and defying policy, and they're not asking for permission because 70,000 fucking people died last year.
Exactly. That's insane.
And that's obscene.
Yeah, that is obscene. And it's just also, I don't know, it's just so, I mean, it's a little bit philosophical, but like, you know, you think about the so-called sort of tenets of the United States, which is like, you know, like freedom or whatever. And it's like, okay, then why don't we have the freedom to use whatever substances we want to use, right? Like what freedom, like on a society that's built on slavery and colonization, obviously there's a lot of problems with the idea of freedom from the very outset, but it's just so, I just don't see why. Anyways, I hope that like a lot of these exciting movements and the sort of like the clandestine stuff and the people going rogue just start taking up more space. Like I think that's the thing with Ocasio-Cortez that has been like so exciting, is just seeing someone who's not compromising and who's just taking up like a lot of space.
Yeah.
And who's not like watering down, you know, her discourse and stuff like.
Fox
and I feel like
is a 24/7 infomercial for her right now.
On what? Oh, yeah,
Fox
I know,
News
right?
is a 24/7 infomercial
for everyone. Like, oh, that's awesome, right?
Right. They're like accidentally doing propaganda for her.
Right.
They're like free education, free healthcare. This is crazy.
Good.
No, people
More
nodding
like
in their family rooms are like, oh, that actually sounds pretty good.
More like that. Like I feel like she's one of the most visible sort of folks and doing what needs to be done right now, just taking those big ideas and just getting them to take up a lot of space.
Yeah, and I think what you're communicating and feeling is what a lot of people are right now, which is they finally have a politician who represents them. I'm 29 and like what Joe Biden was like had my best interest. Like, I've never had a politician to root for like so it's something new for us growing up right now to have someone who speaks our language and wants what we want.
And I think there's limitations built into the system that, you know, she's obviously coming in contact with and confronting, but it is, I have to admit, it's very inspiring.
Yeah. So as depressing as this conversation has been, I think we're ending on a good note that people are defying sort of these policies that criminalize end users and harm the victims, and that there is a sea change potentially coming because people are pissed off and radicalized.
Prohibition is good for the state. It's very good for them. It's an amazing tool through which they can finance mercenaries and private armies without using taxpayers' money. And we've seen it in Cuba, and we saw it in Nicaragua with the Contras, and we see it with the way the paramilitaries operate in Colombia, and we see it in Mexico. It's and they need to stop. Prohibition, it needs to end. Like, I think this is really central, and I think that it's good when our conversations about prohibition don't just focus on the drugs, but we also talk about like the militarization and the police and all the kinds of stuff that go along with it in the United States and elsewhere, and not see them as such separate things. Like, I really think the United States, unfortunately, is the model of the society that the United States is trying to make all their societies in its image. And what kind of society is that? It's a totally racist, white supremacist society that incarcerates a massive amount of its population and impoverishes a massive amount of its poverty and denies, you know, huge amounts of its population, you know, education and healthcare and so on. Like, nobody wants that society. Mm-hmm. So I think, you know, it's really cool to think about changes within the United States also reflecting out, and also being able to take inspiration within the United States from different movements, like in Mexico, or the women's movement right now in Argentina and Uruguay, which, you know, tomorrow is the 8th of March, and those women are making a revolution in South America. And like, let us all join, right? Like, throughout the Americas, you know, against borders and against prisons and against prohibition.
Yeah, well, that's a good place to wrap up. Dawn, thank you so much for taking drug policy out of its silo and centering it in the material conditions that affect everyday people.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
That was Dawn Paley, an independent journalist with a Ph.D. from Autonomous University of Puebla, Mexico. check out her website, dawnpaley.ca. Narcotica is an independent production by Christopher Moraff, Troy Farah, and me, Zachary Siegel. Our theme music is from Glassboy. You can follow us on Twitter at Narcocast, or check out our website, narcocast.com. If you'd like to support us, please subscribe and donate to us on patreon.com/narcotica. We couldn't do this show without you helping and supporting us. You can also give us a rating on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. It helps people find the show. Till next time.